Good afternoon. Thank you, Daniel. And can I first say how much we're all enjoying the hospitality of our hosts here in South Korea. It's been an excellent congress. Today, I'll start by discussing what we mean by a conceptual model, briefly. The main meat of my presentation then is to take us on a tour of the draft, a sketch perhaps. And I'll finish by very briefly setting out what happens next. I thought it would be useful to start by giving you some background to RiC as a conceptual model, as a document, and make clear what its purposes are and indeed what its purposes are not. So what do we mean by conceptual then in this context? Our area of interest, of course, is the description of the records we care for as archives, which, as Daniel has set out, represent the complex affairs of human society over time. Given this, our purpose, simply put, is to represent this complexity in terms of its high-level concepts. In doing so, the methodology for our work is entity relationship modelling, and so we've defined the key things, or entities, necessary to effectively describe archival records for our purposes and for those of our users. That is, the records themselves, the people who create them, and so on, as we'll see. We've defined the significant relations between those entities, and we've defined the properties or attributes of those entities. The result then is a consultation draft, as you've been told today, and indeed some of you I know I've seen in the other sessions as well, for which we need feedback. So please give us your feedback. This then is a generalised view of archival description. It shouldn't be confused with more detailed logical or physical data models necessary to build archival information systems, or the tools that archivists use on a day-to-day basis. So RiC is not a set of cataloguing guidelines. Or indeed, and maybe more Florence's territory, it's not an XML schema for data exchange, such as EAD or EAC-CPF. Rather, the conceptual model, alongside the ontology, provides a basis for future amendment and development of such data models, cataloguing guidelines and schema. Conversely, and this is important, it doesn't mean that all existing archival cataloguing information systems will somehow be wrong or instantly out of date when the model is published. We won't be expecting everyone to suddenly be cataloguing in new ways. That would obviously be impractical. Rather, it will suggest what should be described at a high level, not how actual descriptive metadata archives should be captured, stored, formatted and presented in detail. Most of what is done today will still conform to the model to a great extent. While the model must present the current professional consensus about archival description, our practice will continue to develop and change. And so the first published version of it will not be set in stone. It should, though, help to inform ongoing discussions about what we do when we describe archives, and have a useful role in the education and training of archivists at all stages of their career. It will also enable us, importantly, and again as has already been mentioned, to better collaborate with fellow information professionals, especially within cultural heritage perhaps, but also the record-keeping world, of course, who have already developed models specific to their particular domains, and position us to ensure that the archives in our care take their proper place in the developing digital sphere. Again, as is being quoted quite a lot from John Hocking's plenary on Tuesday, RiC is conceived to take us out of our archival description, out of our archival box and out into the world. This is a frankly complex and daunting task, but fortunately, of course, there's a great deal of work on which we're building. We began then by comparing and contrasting a set of pre-existing models for archives and other domains. And these will be found referenced alongside a more general literature review in the bibliography and consultation draft. And that, I think, makes the point very clearly. There has been some original thinking, but in many ways we are building on a great deal of thinking over a long period of time, some of which has been done by some of the people, certainly I can see in this room. So while we are building on the work of the ICA's previous standards committees, and of course that will be the point of departure for the professional community when it comes to assessing and using the conceptual model, the basis for our analysis, of course, was then the ICA framework for archival description. And by this framework, I mean ICA-RiC and its companion standards, as you can see there on the slides. While this doesn't, of course, constitute a conceptual model in its own right, as Daniel has said, I think it does implicitly suggest such a model. And the previous practice committee recognised this in its final reports. We included models currently in development by Finnish Spanish representatives whose experience we're lucky enough to have on the group, and we heard from our Spanish colleague yesterday at a session about the work of the Spanish Standards Committee. And our area of interest, of course, is records and their context in the broadest sense, not only those that become archives. We included the Australian Government Record-Keeping Metadata Standard developed by the National Archives of Australia and related implementation guidelines. And finally, of course, we are also referring to models in other cultural heritage domains, again, has been said. And you can see there in the centre the library standards, FERBA, which of course are now being developed into a single library reference model, FERBA LRM, which has similarities, I think, with what we're trying to do for RiC. And of course, a more complex CDOC CRM from the world of museum. That analysis showed us two key things, really. First, due to the differing perspectives and contexts, none of these models, none of those models were the model that we actually needed. Second, though, while there are differences in detail, there was a great deal of consensus. There was almost a complete agreement on the key things necessary to document when describing archives. Those in the Spanish model, so this is the slide here is from the Spanish model, not from RiC. But again, you can, as you'll see, it sets out the key areas for the entities. And there's also a broad consensus on the properties of the entities and the key relations necessary. So we work to finalise the entities, their properties and the relations between them, as I've said. And so today I can't go into a great deal of detail, but as I said, try and give you a sketch. We began with the entities, I'll begin with the entities where I'll probably spend most time, and you'll see that we have two types. So there are those entities that are really of the particular concern of us archivists and record keepers, record managers, those relating to records, to people and to business. And you'll see that we've modelled a number of entities in each of these areas. And then there's also a group of broadly contextual entities, interest and concern for which is shared, and in particular places and dates, space and time, and sort of topics more generally. So I'm going to go through now as a sketch of the model, looking at the entities in particular, and you'll notice my rather homespun diagrams. And you'll also see that the boxes represent the entities, and the phrase in between represents the relations. And it'll be useful to think about those and remember some of those as we talk about relations perhaps a bit later on. So we start then with the what, if you like, the record itself. And seen here are the most significant changes from ICA-RiC, as I think Daniel has already suggested. The draft has three distinct entities, representing the record, its parts, and the group or groups of which it may be a member. So centrally then, we have the record entity. Again, and we have one definition here. I'm not going to give all the definitions, but this one is important because it's broad. The linguistic, symbolic or graphic information represented in any persistent form, on any durable carrier, by any method, by an agent in the course of life or work events and activities. Traditionally, as expressed in ICA-RiC, for example, this equates to the item level unit of description. We know, though, that records, particularly perhaps those created and managed electronically, but not exclusively so, may themselves be made up of parts, and we call this entity the record component. And records, of course, may themselves be members of groups, aggregations, or sets, perhaps. The record set entity is an aggregation of records that an agent has grouped together based on some property or properties, or relation or relations, in order to serve its ends or end of their own. The set then may be a series of records brought together in the course of documenting a particular activity. As a record set can hold other record sets arranged hierarchically, that series may be one of many grouped in a superset based on provenance, the records of a particular creator, a fond, if you like. The model then allows traditional multi-level description of fond, or indeed at series level. It also, though, allows records to be seen within other groups. Many of us have collections of material that were brought together based on criteria such as topic or place, rather than provenance, for example. Increasingly, though, as we are hearing a great deal, of course, at this Congress, records are created in electronic environments, where they may be arranged and rearranged to suit the needs of their creators. Users of archives also group records in ways which suit them, their interests, their contexts. The point being, then, that a record at any point in time may belong to many groups, not simply those defined by a single hierarchical arrangement. And modelling record set as a separate entity, as Daniel said, allows us to describe the complexity in which records are created, maintained and used over time. So again, as has been said, it allows multi-level description, but we're talking about more. It's a multi-dimensional or multi-contextual, perhaps, description. Finally, when looking at the record, we have the entity documentary form, which equates to the model or conventions that prescribe the elements that make up particular types of document. A letter, an email, a will, perhaps. As such, this entity connects RiC to the science of diplomatics and the forensic models of particular record types. We move then to the who, not the rock band, but those who create, manage and use records. The agent entity includes persons and groups, including families, corporate bodies, as well as what are termed delegate agents, or such as software, robots or probes, that are created by persons or groups that act in an autonomous or semi-autonomous way. While we're usually interested, of course, in the real person or group, that is their given identity, acting in relation to records, people often also act with assumed identities, by the use of pseudonyms perhaps, and RiC allows these different identities and relations between them to be modelled. RiC, though, has two further entities that model the contexts in which people act in relation to records, persons in particular, the position or role within a corporate body, which will often be associated with a particular occupation, the profession or trade, which give a person the competencies needed to successfully carry out the functions and activities that produce records. By defining these entities, then, RiC-based descriptions will allow users to navigate to records created over time by persons holding particular positions within a corporate body where known, and pursuing particular occupations. And there you can see on the slide there, and I didn't spend time with the previous one, perhaps I should have done. And so you can see there that we're simply saying we have an agent, in this case an agent of type person, and they may occupy a particular position. Perhaps they're a president or from where I come, a prime minister in their country. And so they have that role, they have that job in a sense. But that person is also, in a sense, pursuing an occupation, and perhaps that occupation in this example would be a politician. And very often we would then associate the particular role, position, prime minister or president, with a particular occupation of being a politician. We then have the entities that model the how and the why agents act and create records. That's the business entities. The ICA standard for describing functions, ISDF, related to both functions, that is the broad goals or purposes of an agent, and to activities, that is the actions or transaction performed by an agent in fulfillment of those functions. And RiC models these as two separate entities, function and activity, which exist within a specific social or cultural context, but may, of course, change over time. As we may, though, want to be able to see how the particular instances of a function relate to each other across the different contexts in which particular agents act, RiC also has a function abstract entity. Yes, I'll say a little bit more about that. So you can see we have the function centrally, and you can see that we have an agent as well, and an agent the functions are being fulfilled by an agent who is then performing particular activities. And so there is a relation between function and activity, so function is fulfilled by the performance of those activities. And then you can see the idea of the function abstract there, so this very particular function of a particular agent, we can abstract to look at more generic functions over time, so this function is simply an example of a more generic function, perhaps. Tying the business entities together then, with agents, we have mandate, which is defined as the authority or rules that define the functions and activities of an agent. In other words, a mandate is a source of authority for an agent to act. This authority may be tacit, such as social customs or expectations, or in the case of a creative person, a sort of self-motivation mandate, in a sense. It will often, though, of course, particularly in the organisational context, be expressed in documents, such as laws, regulations, standards, rules, and so on, including RiC, then, perhaps, which can be seen as a mandate for the way an archivist describes records. It's important to note, then, that a mandate is in itself intangible and should not be confused with the documents, records perhaps, which provide the evidence for it. Again, we have a diagram, this time focusing on mandate, authorising agents to do things, and remembering the other diagram, it's also defining those functions and activities that an agent is carrying out. And then finally, a mandate may be evidenced by a record. Finally, there are three entities in RiC which, as they represent areas in which we share interests with others, particularly in the cultural heritage domain perhaps, we've not modelled to the same extent as those that relate more specifically to the creation, management and use of records. We have place, defined as any geographic or administrative point or area, so broadly, to enable description of the spatial context relating to other entities, such as the places that may be the subject of records, or where records are held, or significant places in the history of agents, where a person was born, or lived, or worked, or died, for example. Or indeed the jurisdiction, perhaps, to which a mandate applies. Again, the diagram. So we have a place where some records were held in the past, a place where an agent was born, but the place perhaps where the area, the jurisdiction that a particular mandate covers currently. We also have date, of course, to enable description of the temporal context relating to other entities. Significantly, when a record or record sets were created, of course, or modified or changed or something happened to them. All of the dates, again, of important events in the life of agents, whether when they were born, or indeed when a corporate body is active or began or ended, and so on. Or indeed periods when, again, functions, activities, occupations, positions and mandates are in existence. And again, I won't continue to labour the diagram, hopefully you're there now. You can see that we have a date creating records when an agent was born and the active date for a particular mandate. While the records entities may have other entities as their subject, agents, of course, or as noted, places may be the subjects of records commonly, we finally have the concept thing entity, which captures the broad topics that may be the subject of the record and business entities in particular. This then bundles together abstract ideas, material things and events, including those, where appropriate, that are legendary or fictitious. In a sense, this entity, of course, also includes all of the other entities, because it's very broadly defined, but we're sort of raising the other entities because our area of interest is archival description. And here, this entity is here particularly to allow us to describe all of those things, in particular that may be the subjects of records. And again, we have an example where we have agents as subject, and we have a place as a subject, and we have some sort of concept or something else that is a subject of the records. We move then to the properties. In the draft, you'll see we've set out properties for each of our entities, and these again can be sort of characterised as two types. First are those that are common to all entities. These mainly relate to the identification of the entity, such as a globally persistent identifier, other local identifiers, and by local here we mean anything that isn't the globally persistent, so it could be local for an entire region down to local for your particular institution. And the name by which the entity is known. There's also, as there always seems to have to be, a general note property as well. As the entities are different, though, the other properties defined for each entity are to an extent different as well. Indeed, many of the properties will be familiar to you from the elements found in the ICA description standards, but there are differences, of course. And again, maybe to labour the point, and again, as I try to represent on the diagram on the slide, there's no creator property for the record entity in RiC, as there is a creator element in ICA-G. RiC being an entity relationship model, creation is seen as a relation between a record and one or more agents, again, as you can see on the slide. So we have an agent created a record. You can also see there, trying to give an idea of the properties and the information that might be gathered about each of those entities. Aside from the identification properties, those for record break down into those describing as sort of in four areas. So there's a description of the scope and the content of the record. That is the information it holds, its extent, its reliability and viability for use, and how it is expressed, perceived by users. There's a description of how that information is represented. So the encoding format for digital records, and the mediation device, if it is necessary to have one. There's a description also of records production technique, and of course a language and scripts in which the information is expressed. Then there is a description of the carrier, that is physical description, its physical extent and medium or carrier type. And finally, of course, the description about the management and use of the record, its history, how it may have been classified, its conditions of access and use, and its state as a draft or a copy, perhaps. While we don't tend, on the whole, certainly in an analogue world, to describe the record components in detail, where necessary to do so, it has in RiC the same set of properties available as the record. When it comes to the record set, the properties break down differently, reflecting the fact that unlike a record set is sort of both an entity in its own right, a thing in itself, as well as the summation of its aggregate members. And so we have properties in sort of three sorts of group. So initially we have the properties of the record set, the properties that describing the context relating to the creation, management and use of the record set itself by agents, its history and its integrity and classification, its arrangement, and whether and when there may be accruals to it. We also have the ability to categorise a record set in terms of its nature or level of aggregation. This there then is where the ICA-G levels would be found. So the value for this might be font or series or file, or indeed it could be collection or something else, accession. Then there are the properties summarising the scope, content and extent of the members of the record set. And finally, given that a record set is by definition an aggregation where members may have one or more properties in common, any of the other properties for a record may be used to describe a record set where they are shared by all or significant, perhaps, numbers of that set. Looking at the other entities, 3 of them have specific additional properties. For the agent entity, there are properties which define their type, person or corporate body, and identity type, as I mentioned previously, so given perhaps or assumed, as well as an agent's history and associated language information. There are some that relate also to particular types of agent, so the gender of a person, the technical characteristics of a delegate agent, as well as a set of properties relating to corporate bodies that allow the capture of the information in relation to institutions holding archives set out in the ICA's ISDEA standard, so services to the public, contact information, operating hours and facilities. As well as a type property to allow characterization, for place we have an additional properties allowing the capture of geocoordinates and addresses, as well as those that describe the calendar relating to a particular date. The remaining entities, modelled so far less specifically perhaps, have 3 additional properties allowing for their characterization by type, a general description of a particular instance of the entity and its history. We move then, and finally we come to relations. And as I said, you've been seeing many of these in the diagrams as we've moved along. And in the first draft, we've listed a set of relations between our entities that are significant for the purposes of archival description. As you have seen, I mean, they're in the form of simple binary relations in both directions. For example, has subject, is subject of, between a record and an agent or a place. There are nearly 400 such bidirectional statements set out in the consultation draft. That is nearly 800 numbered entries when looked at entity by entity. When considering the list, though, there's a couple of things to remember. There is a general is associated with relation between all entities and between an entity and itself. And all the other relations are more specific statements of relations between entities. Where a relation reflects actions that were logically completed in the past, they're expressed in the past tense. While some relations currently then only exist in the past tense, such as was created by created between a record and an agent, as a record is always in existence before it is described, some relations are given in both the present and the past tense. So there are also was associated with relations between entities reflecting that there was an association that is no longer current. The list in the draft, though, remains suggestive and should not be seen as complete or normative. As one would expect, there is certainly a focus on the relations reflecting the who, the when, and the where of the creation, transmission, management, and use of records, their parts, and aggregations. But there are some other sort of types, maybe the wrong word, but there are some sort of other types as well. So as I mentioned, there is also a group of relations relating to the subjects of record. Also, each of the record agent and business entities are also explicitly related with other instances of the same entity over time with his successor of and his predecessor of relations, as well as being related hierarchically as appropriate for the entity, such as between records and record sets, one being a member of the other, or between superior and subordinate agents, for example. For agents, as well, there are relations with the occupation, position, and business entities reflecting the doing of business that creates records, as well as some that reflect the when and where that business was being done. And finally, for agents, with the type person, of course, there's also a group of relations which relate to family relations, the relations between people, relations proper in a sense. And so, again, finally, on one last but important thing, actually there to note, is that in order to provide for the expression of greater context than simple binary relations allow, for example, to say when and where a record was created, the model allows some relations to have date and place properties, as I've represented on the diagram. So for the last time, we have an agent and we have a record, and on some occasions, all we might know is that there's some association between them, and we're very unclear what that association is. So we can say that there is an association. This agent is associated with this record. We may know more than that, and so we have relations, obviously, the creation relation. So an agent created this record. But RiC is also allowing then to say, well, this relation has properties relating to date and place. And we can say that creation happened on a date, and that date is today's date, and indeed in a place. And that place, of course, is where we are today. So, next steps then. And this is a first draft, but there's still, I think, as Daniel has suggested, an awful lot that we need to do. The first thing is receive, digest, and respond to your feedback. And that, as I've said before, we need. We need to model the control information. That is information about the creation and management of the descriptions by archivists, and that is something yet to be done. We need to discuss and agree the obligation and repeatability status of our properties, and we need indeed to agree and define the full set of relations in the model and give much more there than we have currently in the draft. And I think that relates also to the final point, is that we need to very clearly look at the documentation necessary and provide more explanation, diagrams and examples to make the nature, scope and purposes of the model clear. As we do this, of course, we'll be continuing to validate the model against a developing ontology. And that seems a good place to hand over to Florence.